My name is Milena Leiwert, and I'm part of the Strategy as Practice social media team, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this webinar with the title Algorithms as Strategy as Practice Research. The webinar is hosted by the Strategizing Activities and Practices Interest Group, and with this format, we want to create a space for learning for both SAP newbies as well as more advanced scholars. We have two speakers today, Vern Glaser and Luciana D'Adderio, who are going to present their work based on a paper that they've published in Organization Theory. A warm welcome to both of you, and for those who don't know Luciana and Vern, I will say a few words on their backgrounds. Vern is a professor of entrepreneurship and family enterprise as well as business at the University of Alberta at the Department of Strategy, Entrepreneurship and Management, and in his SAP-related work, he studies how organizations use algorithms to change organizational capabilities. And Luciana is Chancellor's Fellow in Data-Driven Innovation at Usher's Institute at the University of Edinburgh. And she has experience in studying routines and digital technologies such as algorithms. Again, thanks for presenting today and discussing today. And we are very much looking forward to your presentations now.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk a little bit about algorithms and SAP research. I think, as we all know, organizations are increasingly using algorithms as an integral tool in their strategic arsenal. If you think about it, you have companies like Netflix or Amazon that are really presenting us with consumer recommendation algorithms all the time that are shaping our lives. But additionally, we have pricing algorithms. If you look at airline companies, for example, and I don't know if you've bought air travel recently, but the prices are changing all the time. These are all being driven by algorithmic analysis. I just read an article the other day about how rent prices are being increased by algorithms, and in a lot of places like New York City, rents are actually up by 14 to 15%. Because organizations are strategically using algorithms to basically help them identify how much they can charge. Another example where algorithms are being used, and I'm going to go into this in a lot more detail later on in the presentation, is with human resources analytics. But in many ways, organizations are just using these algorithms, and they're not just peripheral; they're actually central to the strategic decision making that they're using. Luciana, if you maybe go to the next slide. Now, one question before we get started on this is, what is an algorithm? And, this is a comic from a long time ago, but, from Dilbert. Dogbert says, I've been asked to reduce headcount. And then he says, to be fair about it, I created a scientific algorithm to decide who goes. And he said, well, I thought you were firing the people with highest salaries. And so Dogbert says, well, okay, maybe algorithm is an overstatement. And in many ways, this is a joke, but that really is an algorithm. And in many ways, when organizations are using algorithms, they're using these type of simple rules or heuristics to be able to make decisions. But ultimately, what's happening is these algorithms are getting increasingly complicated, and they're becoming increasingly central to the business. And next slide there. Now, from a strategy as practice perspective, I think algorithms are materially influencing each of the 4 Ps we have in strategy as practice. So, on the one hand, we have algorithmic practices that are becoming increasingly common in organizations. But as well, algorithms are also obviously playing a direct role in the praxis of many organizations in the sense of how they're actually going about doing the work that they're doing. Beyond that, algorithms are reshaping the agency of practitioners, and I think in many ways, if you think of like Richard's latest book talking about the role of the professions, I think in many ways algorithmic usage is probably spreading through the professional consulting communities. And so what we really want to do in this talk is kind of facilitate a discussion about how we can study how algorithms influence the strategic activities of the organizations. Because in many ways, I think that we have to approach research, and the types of questions that we can ask and answer are very different, when due to the use of algorithms and strategy. Go ahead, Luciana.
You see it?
Yeah, this is you, I think.
Oh, okay, all right. So what Vern is saying is that algorithms are a topic of immediate relevance for the sub-community. And of course, one might say, this was also the case for earlier software, such as large-scale enterprise systems, for example, like BDM or SAP. These software systems, they were able to radically reshape organizational strategies and processes with fundamental consequences for outcomes such as innovation, learning, flexibility, efficiency. But today's most advanced algorithms, however, are potentially even more relevant for, I think, at least a couple of reasons. The first one is that algorithms are becoming increasingly pervasive, and they have the potential to diffuse very rapidly within and across practices, organizations, and different sectors of the economy. Now, the second reason is that advanced so-called self-learning algorithms are more opaque and dynamic than their rule-based counterparts, so much so that their inner workings may be unknown even to their own designers. Now, for these reasons, there is a proliferation of debates around algorithms, and people will have seen that everywhere we go. An important question that we want to ask here is, how do we understand and study algorithms and their influence over strategies, practices, and practitioners? Now, when talking about algorithms, advocates on one side and critics on the others mainly have pointed out two extreme effects. So the advocates highlighting the positive transformative effects of algorithms, and the critics instead emphasizing the dangers and the risks involved in adopting those algorithms. But the reality is that algorithmic effects are so much more complex, subtle, and pervasive than it is allowed currently in the literature. And also, their effects depend on a specific technology and the particular implementation and circumstances of design and use. So as scholars, we are really faced with this dilemma: how do we understand and study these effects of algorithms on people, strategies, and organizations? Now, I want to start from the key observation that how we study algorithms depends on how we understand their characteristics and their effects. So, underneath much of the current understanding of algorithms lies a narrow view of these technologies as discrete and objectified entities, which are seen pretty much as being separate from their context. Now, this simplified view to characterize algorithms, we posit, can only lead to binary, black and white, on-off type of analysis, which either highlight the algorithm's costs or risks or their benefits. Now, this objectified view has very much polarized the debate, in our opinion. On one side, we see those that emphasize the benefits, for example, how algorithms help facilitating value creation, automating repetitive work, improving the flow of ideas. And on the other, we see those who emphasize the so-called dark side of algorithms as the potential, for example, of coercing workers, imposing inflexible rules, and manipulating individuals. So neither these views, we argue, are completely right or completely wrong, but really the devil here is very much in the detail. So let's examine these problems with black boxing approaches more closely. So first of all, algorithms are seen as all-powerful on one hand, the direct cause of radical and social organizational upheaval, or on the other, they're seen as entirely powerless, at the exclusive mercy of human actors and their choices. So this dichotomy has prevented us as scholars from examining the deeper, the more nuanced effects of algorithms, which are always emergent and always contingent. The second point is that the movement of algorithms from one side to another is mostly seen in terms of straightforward diffusion, where the technology impacts the organization and in so doing remains unchanged. Now, this view overlooks the progressive transformation algorithms undergo as they are adopted across sites and over their lifespan. Now, these materializations, as we call them, are complex socio-technical translations. So they're not instant changes. They involve a whole range of actors and actants who appropriate and modify the algorithms at each site. And the third point is that algorithms are seen as basically as decontextualized, as almost as if they are acting in a vacuum. In contrast, we argue that they can be more usefully understood as being deeply embedded within their context, or the webs of actions and relationships which shape the algorithms, and they are shaped in turn by them. And so, to overcome these drawbacks, in our paper, we propose adopting a performative view of algorithms and their effects. This is based on performativity theory as developed in some of our recent papers that you can see there at the bottom of the slide. What we are saying here is that the assumptions encoded in the algorithm at the design stage do not alone determine the effects of algorithms. The effects instead will depend on the entire assemblage of social and material features that enact the algorithm throughout their lifespan. So these are as much involved in shaping the algorithm effects as the initial setting. So performativity in this way offers a way to avoid technological determinism. But it is also a way to overcome sociological socio-determinism. As we consider how algorithms constrain and modify human actors, sometimes without them even being aware of it. So this shows how human actors are not all-powerful either. And so this is what we mean very simply in a nutshell with the term algorithmic assemblage, is the fact that algorithms are better understood as deeply embedded in their context of design, of adoption and use, as opposed to being standalone objects, and to study the varying effects while avoiding all kinds of determinism. And so what does it mean in practice to view algorithms as assemblages? Well, it means seeing algorithms as relational networks whose properties evolve and shift as they are appropriated and enacted across contexts and over time. Now, these assemblages are very much socio-material in the sense that they are made up of a myriad of features whose configurations truly matter. They make a difference, so different configurations imply different effects. But this also means that the rules that are embedded in and created by the algorithms may be agentic in that they fundamentally shape practices and routines that enact them. But the outcomes will always be emergent. So this is true of all algorithms. I mean, in fact, all technologies have always been agentic. This is not new. But they're especially relevant for so-called, learning algorithms, as they tend to exert an even more decisive, invisible, and pervasive influence over practices and routines. So now we are going to illustrate some of these concepts in practice, and we're going to look at how we understand an algorithm and study it by going through a rich and real world example that Vern is gonna take us through.
May I briefly interrupt? I think the slides are a little bit cut on the down, like on the edge. Maybe you could check for that, Luciana. That would be nice.
So,
well, this one is totally fine. The others were a little bit cut.
Oh, I see. Okay. I don't think that I can change that.
Okay, no worries. I think it's fine. We see most of it.
Yeah, I think that the next ones are not going to be too problematic, I hope.
Yeah, I think that's there. I definitely saw that too. So when we want to look at studying algorithms from how organizations use algorithms strategically, the tendency to kind of put the theoretical discussion that Luciana just had and kind of deploy it into practice, we would study it as a computational tool, would be like a typical way to do that. And for that, we would essentially look at an algorithm and identify what is the recipe. In this instance, a nice definition of algorithms is it's a precise recipe that specifies an exact sequence of steps required to solve a problem. And so if you want to study an algorithm as a computational tool, you would need to understand what that recipe is. And basically the computational tool of an algorithm is basically identifying an objective, what needs to be done in a particular situation, with a control, which would be how the algorithm is to be done. And so I think that this is, to a certain extent, a base requirement of doing algorithmic research is to understand it as a computational tool. But the perspective that we're advocating suggests that we can't just stop there and just understand what the algorithmic formula is. We need to actually go to the next step and look at it as an assemblage. If you can shift there, Luciana. And I think specifically when we're looking at algorithms strategically, the way to look at this is to unpack the assemblage in a little bit more detail. So the way that we've been thinking about this is, if you want to understand an algorithmic assemblage, think in terms of there's the algorithm, which would be the formula or the rule for how to make a decision. But it also involves the data. What's the electronic information that's used to be able to process this? It also involves a decision. Typically when you have some sort of an algorithmic analysis, there's an output of the algorithmic analysis that would be it could be a decision that's made, or it could be a bit of information, but essentially the outcome of the algorithm needs to be understood. And then maybe even more importantly, all algorithms are essentially deployed in context of routines, right? So a routine is, an algorithm might make a decision within a routine, but the algorithm in and of itself is not the only part of the routine. So if we think of a typical algorithm, like most of us probably are familiar with Netflix, and might have a Netflix recommendation algorithm that suggests what movies we might want to watch. There is a formula that would look at our past viewing history and maybe our demographic information that would identify what that recommendation is. But there's lots of different ways that formula can be deployed within the organization. And so what our argument is in this paper and in our research agenda is basically we always want to understand how the algorithms are entangled in this, kind of directly within an algorithm itself is always entangled within data, decisions, and routines, and we need to understand that. So now to illustrate that, I want to use an example of Wonderlic. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with Wonderlic, but Wonderlic is a company that does, I would describe them as being in the human resources analytics space. So they're a company that's about 85 years old, and what they were originally known for is they had a cognitive test. And the idea of the cognitive test is that you would give a person 50 questions, and a job candidate would answer these 50 questions, and they would answer as many of those 50 questions as they can within 12 minutes. And, typically these questions, feature things like simple math. It could be basic logic, language comprehension, spatial reasoning, pattern identification. And the idea of these tests is that the questions become more difficult as the test progresses. And they say what you see in here is, quote, our scoring algorithm is based on a candidate's overall response pattern. Additionally, weighting each question based on the level of difficulty and the impact of guessing. This produces a far more precise estimate of cognitive ability than a score based only on the total number of correct answers. And so what they do is they essentially have an algorithm that they use, kind of using item response theory, for those of you who are familiar with the statistics behind it, that constructs a cognitive ability score. So you could think in terms of if someone is applying to be a heavy equipment operator, they might take the cognitive ability test and they might get a score of 85 or something to that effect. Now, what's interesting about their system is, there's a score that they would have, but then you would also have to, if you're looking at hiring a person for a job, you wouldn't just want to look at their cognitive ability. You might also want to look at their personality. And so the idea of this, what Wonderlic has done is they basically have created a 90 question, 20 to 30 minute test where they ask a bunch of questions and they essentially assess and evaluate your personality. And what they've done with this is they've created, so they base personality on the theory of the big 5 personality traits, which most of you are familiar with: openness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, extroversion, and forgetting what the last one is off the top of my head, but the agreeableness. So they basically, they brand, as a company, they've branded, openness is open-mindedness, agreeableness is, something like cooperation, right? So they have their own brands for this, but basically they're using a test to essentially evaluate someone's personality. And again, they kind of come up with an algorithmic score for what personality is on a scale of 0 to 100. And then finally, they use one of the motivational scholars, a guy named Holland, has created a theory of motivation that essentially identifies there's 6 different types of things that can, that you can be motivated by. That might range from your desire to be investigative to your desire to be supportive and help people. Could be related to, how much you want to kind of follow tradition. So there's 6 of these different items that are motivation, and there they have another 58 forced choice questions that would be answered in 20 minutes. And what's interesting when you look at how this company has, kind of strategically leveraged algorithms, they basically take the cognitive ability, the motivation score, and the personality score, and they collapse all 3 of these into what they call a 1 score. And that 1 score is basically matched. So that would be based on what the candidate does. That's matched with an AI-powered job directory. So, basically you would say, well, if you think of the cognitive ability, motivation, and personality that someone might need to be a heavy equipment operator versus being an academic, for example, those might feature very different, kind of distributions of personalities. And so what they've done is they've created an AI-powered job directory. So the U.S. government has a kind of like a central database that the Labor Department collects that essentially describes 1,100 or 1,200 different jobs in a lot of detail. So it would talk through and say what exactly these jobs do, what are the skills that are required for the jobs, what are the competencies that are required for the jobs. There's a lot of text on this, and they basically have created, they use this US job database of 1,100 jobs. And they use it essentially as a training algorithm to then be able to analyze and assess over 3.5 million jobs that they have in their database. And so what they're doing is they're using artificial intelligence to basically take take these jobs and match these jobs with particular candidate profiles. And this then becomes a way that they allow prospective employers to be able to screen job candidates. So is there any questions about this? Just to, I'm going to kind of apply this to our framework in a second, but any questions about how the Wonderlic process works? I mean, it's an interesting process. And, when you look at it, the question is, does it make sense or doesn't it make sense? If we go to the next slide, if you look at this as a computational tool, right, which would be one way to look at this, you could identify, you have these testing measures, and algorithmic decision-making are basically used to create these scores. And then the algorithmic decision-making is comparing the score with the ideal candidate. What's interesting about this is, this process is full of the use of proxies, right? Is the number of questions you answer right on a 50-question test in 12 minutes, is that really a proxy for intelligence? They're kind of assuming that there's one such thing as general cognitive ability, but a lot of us might think that there are different forms of intelligence, like you might have emotional intelligence versus analytical intelligence. This would not take that into account at all. So many people might critique the whole concept of this. Similarly, the idea of taking 5 personality traits and identifying that that there can be a score that amalgamates, openness, extroversion, and neuroticism, agreeableness, and conscientiousness into like one score that can accurately reflect the potential of a candidate for a job. One might argue that that's crazy if you just look at it from a computational tool perspective. But what's interesting for me is if you look at a company who might be using and deploying the Wonderlic set of services, products and services within their organization to achieve to develop a hiring capability, let's say. When you think of it more broadly, the one score would only be one part of the company's process. For example, you could complement the data from the tests with interviews. That might be one way to look at this. So, I was recently hiring for a position in our family business center, an executive director. And one of the things, we didn't use the Wonderlic specifically, but we used one of their competitors. And the idea behind that was that the test indicated that the candidates had certain weaknesses or issues that we might want to probe on. And so what they did is they actually asked us, they actually suggested different types of interview questions that might be relevant to ask in a final round of interviews based on the personality and motivational data that were there. So similarly, you can break the scores down into constituent parts that can be used and analyzed. So Wonderlic, and I think this is a nice part of the way that their system works, is they break apart that one score of, let's say your motivation is 85, but you could identify that that it's a 90 in investigative tendencies, and it might be a 20 with respect to tradition. So you might be able to know this person's really creative, but they might not be very motivated if they're doing something that's more traditional and more day-to-day or clerical. The point being that this one score could be used as a screening process that could basically say who's in or who's out of of being a job candidate. But it could also be used in very nuanced ways within the broader assemblage of the hiring routine itself. And so our argument is that it's imperative, if we're studying how algorithms are being used in strategic situations, it's really important to view it from the assemblage perspective, because the computational tool in and of itself is never enough. You always have to understand how the algorithms is embedded in context. And so our suggestion is that when you really look at what's the data that's going into it, what are the decisions that are coming out of it, and how is that embedded in the broader routine, this enables you to more effectively theorize the strategic dimensions of the Wonderlic or any type of algorithm that's being deployed.
All right. So thanks, Vern. And so to recap, in the first part of our talk, and also the first part of our paper, we were looking to improve on how we understand algorithms. Now, however, we can focus on the second step, which is to understand how the implications of how we characterize algorithms for how we study them. So to do this, we use the notion of an artifact's biography. Now, the term biography of an artifact originally comes from the field of information systems and from the work of Pollock and Williams. They have a book in 2009 where they used this approach to trace the evolution of ERP software across different sites and over time. Now, this interesting approach was then applied by myself and Neil Pollock in the 2014 organization studies paper to look at the biography of a computer board, as we called it. So in other words, there was the progress of a board, literally a computer board. Has it crossed the boundaries between the software and hardware producer and the supplier, and all the kind of controversies that were emerging along that border. But then it is in this most recent paper with Glaser and Pollock that we developed the biographical approach to study algorithms. So let's see this in a little bit more detail. Now, the question that we ask here is, how do we trace the evolution of algorithms as they travel across context and as they evolve over time? And how do we account for and unravel that complexity so that we can appreciate how algorithms work and indeed how they don't work sometimes? Then note that by no means here we are suggesting that scholars should necessarily map the entire biographical journey of an algorithm. I mean, this would be very valuable for sure, but it would be unquestionably very difficult to do unless you are a large research team and or you have a very long study that stretches over a long period of time. Now, what we are proposing here as a device is that we should be able to select and focus on one or more specific biographical moments that capture a critical shift in the assemblage. Now, here we highlight, in the paper, we highlight 3 examples of moments. And the first moment here refers to the power of controversies and struggles to highlight some of the most relevant socio-material dynamics that shape an algorithm within its context of application and across contexts. Now, this could be, for example, when an algorithm assumption or logic, for example, conflicts with other technology or other organizational assumptions and logics. This, for example, could occur during implementation. The second moment captures the critical processes through which various programs of action become inscribed in or embedded into the algorithm, and they are performed at different sites and at different times. So this could be, for example, during design stage or during implementation, or it could be during deployment. And the third moment highlights the power of transfer processes in revealing the socio-material dynamics that underpin the workings of an algorithm, including when an algorithm travels across sites, sectors, and organizations. Now, here we have to lay out a few disclaimers. First of all, the moments, when we talk about moments, really we are talking about microprocesses. So this is very important for us, this dynamic element. The second thing to highlight is that these moments that we have mentioned just here and in the paper, they're not at all exhaustive. There can be many more ones, and there could be different ones that we invite the community to go out and find for us. Now, the other thing is that these moments are not mutually exclusive, so they can all be present within a biography at different times, or even they can coexist. And also, they're not to be understood as operating sequentially, so you don't necessarily have one moment after the other, but they can occur or take place in all sorts of different orders. So what we want to show here also is another aspect, which is that the performativity framework also allows us to appreciate a little bit more the various transformations that algorithms undergo as they move across settings and over the course of their lifespan. Now, these transformations include, first of all, the initial translation. So you have the designer of a task or a problem, and the designer translates this into a formula a structured formula and a related rule set, and then it translates it into the source code. And this one, once it is compiled, will perform the task or solve the problem that it was the idea, the reason why the algorithm was created, and a bit like Vern said earlier on. Now, the subsequent translation occurs when the algorithm then travels across different companies or across different sectors. Now, this is really important because you can have an algorithm that starts in a sector with some kind of assumptions that are very specific to that particular sector, and then the algorithm becomes implemented or adopted elsewhere where there aren't the same assumptions, and there may even be opposite or completely different assumptions. So these are very important aspects to take into account when we're doing research on algorithms. So now we can use some of these biographical notions that I have mentioned to see how they can help address algorithms in practice. And so I'm going to pass over to Vern again to go back to the example.
Yeah, so if we go back to the Wonderlic example, and this is where I think the biographical framework becomes really powerful. In many ways, these biographical moments serve as sensitizing questions that can help us understand theoretically what's going on in the situation. So for example, the first moment that we talked about was the idea of addressing and resolving performative struggles. And I think that this is very interesting because if you think of how a company goes about the hiring process, the first performative struggle would be, do they use algorithms in the hiring process at all? Right? That's not necessarily a question that is going to be answered yes. And so if we want to understand the use of algorithms, we can understand the history of kind of how did that fight go? Were there people who disagreed with that? How did they go about deciding to use an algorithm in the first place? But similarly, on top of that, in terms of performative struggles, there's also questions of which algorithm do we use? Is it the Wonderlic or is it the Success Finder, for example? Both of these companies offer unique and different solutions to the problem, to the hiring problem. Wonderlic, for example, we'll talk through, and they'll talk about how they're science-based, and they're basically really focused on leveraging IO psychology in their process. Success Finder might be a little bit more of a qualitative approach to doing this. But similarly, in terms of the performative struggle, we could also identify who takes the tests. Is it, for example, all where do we have people take the tests in terms of within the job funnel? But then we go to the next question, which will be inscribing and layering programs of action. And this is where I think we get into a lot of the work of like, how are the routines designed in order to be able to make this happen? So for example, how do we design a routine for test taking? Do prospective job candidates have to come to our office? Do we have them do it somewhere else? What kind of environment do we put them in for their test taking? How much warning do we give them? If we think of this, online, for example, with these types of tests, you can, any of you could Google, preparing for the Wonderlic, and there's ways, just like you could prepare for the SAT or the GMAT, you could prepare for a test like this. Do you allow prospective candidates to do that or not, based on how you communicate this? Now, another question might be, how do you create job profiles? So one of the, Wonderlic has 3.5 million job profiles that exist, and those job profiles are basically weighting different components of the personality. So for example, Wonderlic might say that if we're hiring for a salesperson, that extroversion is a really important characteristic for a salesperson. But I might, from my experience, might think that salespeople might actually be better who are introverts. There might be something about introverts that make them more effective. So maybe I need to create a custom job profile to highlight the power of an introverted salesperson. Similarly, how do we determine what success is in terms of hiring? This becomes another process that will occur as we're basically determining how we're deploying and designing the algorithm to fit within our routine. So then the third point would be, translating that algorithm to other contexts. And, an example could be, maybe a company is using this to hire customer service reps, but would this also work for another context like hiring for executives? Or do we think that executives might not be as amenable to doing this type of analysis? Or maybe, should we use this for truck drivers if we're hiring truck drivers? Or maybe more radically, could we actually use this for existing employees? Right? Could we take existing employees and have them take the test, and could we use the Wonderlic tool to actually be a way to help us evaluate and manage, or evaluate and kind of do performance reviews with our existing employees? I mean, that might be, you might view that as powerful, you might view that as a little creepy, but at the same point in time, this is a way that the tool could be used and deployed to another context. And the power of the biographical framework, I think, is to be able to sensitize you to really ask these questions and understand some of the dynamics about how the algorithm is actually being used in practice. Yeah. So maybe I'll make a couple comments here, Luciana, and then I'll let you close out there. But ultimately, I think that what we're doing, what we're suggesting with the biographical approach, is that it's important to take a performative perspective, and it's really important to go beyond the algorithm as a computational tool where there's kind of a black box, and really open up the algorithm to scrutiny. I think one of the themes that we're seeing, if you read a lot of the the press that occurs with algorithms, most of the algorithms that occur in organizations are they're very black box, right? Netflix is not telling us what their recommendation algorithm is. The airlines are not telling us what their pricing algorithm is. That makes it very difficult for us to be able to study algorithms if they're not actually letting us understand what the computational tool is. But I think that if we think about the algorithm as an assemblage, we can actually study the algorithms without necessarily knowing exactly what's going on with the algorithm. I mean, one of the things that's interesting, I think that with the illustration that I used with Wonderlic, we can get a fairly good feel for how the algorithmic assemblage is working, even though we don't know what the actual algorithm that Wonderlic is using is. And so I think this becomes very important for us to be able to, how would you say, kind of expose some of the, the inner workings of algorithms that might be more dark in nature per se. And then, another comment here would be that I think that we can move beyond humanism and really look at the materiality of algorithms. And maybe Luciana, you can talk a little bit more about that, about the materiality dimension.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think can be interesting from the perspective of strategist practice is this idea that most of the time the way that we think about practices is as being directed by humans, and objects and artifacts and materials just being accessories to these particular performances. Now, what this biographical and combined biographical and performative approach shows us is that really we need to focus on the materiality of algorithms and give materiality the place that it deserves to have within our analysis of practices, be them strategy practices or any kind of practices more in general. So it's very important that we recognize the role that technology plays within practices in order to understand really what the effects of technology can be. So just to conclude, I think that we can sum up by saying that in this talk we have highlighted the explanatory and analytical potential of combining that performative perspective with a biographical approach to the study of algorithm. And hopefully we've given you some ideas about how you can study the effect of algorithm and strategies on practices and organizations, and indeed practitioners, which are some of the important pillars of the strategist practice research. Now, the important thing that we want to just leave you with is this idea that we need to look at algorithms in their specificity, within their contextual settings, because algorithms, like every technology, but even more than every technology, can really have different effects depending on where you're looking at them and when they are being applied. So you can have the same algorithms that have different implications in different settings, as we talked about the algorithm being imported or transported from one setting to another. But also, even more interestingly, you can have the same algorithm that can have different implications in the same setting. And this is really fundamental in terms of the consequences and the risks that are involved in the application and the adoption of algorithms, especially in high stakes kind of settings. But this is perhaps a story for another day. So I think we will leave it here. Thank you very much for listening.